We need to front load your math a little bit before we do this next section and review the quadratic formula. So right in the center of the page are the words solving quadratic equations. So quadratic equations are equations that have x squared. So remember the one from tangent properties where there was an x squared? But that one canceled. What happens if it doesn't cancel? If you're left with an x squared in your equation, how do we solve that? How do we get rid of that if that's the variable that I have? I only have one, and I have an x and an x squared. So when you're doing this, there are generally two solutions. So we need to know how to solve them and how to make them work. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the idea that to use either of these forms that we're going to review today, remember you did this last year in Algebra 1, Math 100, this must be in standard form. Standard form, which I'll review in a second, is the only way that you can pull out the information correctly from these things. Standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It has to be in that form. Let me erase that again, that looks messy. It has to be ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It has to be like that. If it's written any other way, without the terms in that order, then you will make mistakes. If you don't have, say you're going through this and you don't end up with an x term, then put 0x so that you make sure that you enter in the equation correctly. So let's look at this first example. First of all, it says 2x plus 1 equals 6x. That is not standard form. Standard form says ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where c is always your constant. So to get that, I just need to subtract 6x from both sides. Now here's the first place you can trip up. None of these terms can combine. One's an x squared, one's an x, and one's a constant. Those don't combine. We just rewrite it so that I have 2x squared plus, actually that's minus 6x plus 1 equals 0. This becomes 0. It doesn't just magically disappear. This negative stays, and the x term goes in the middle. So now that I've done that, and we know that whatever's in front of the x is a. That means that a is 2, and b is negative 6, and c is 1. Now that I have that, we're going to use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is a formula that always works. There are other methods for finding solutions to quadratic equations, but this is one that always works. It might give you some ugly answers, but it always works, and in some ways is easier than factoring, which we'll review in a little bit. So now that I've identified a, b, and c, you'll notice in the equation that's minus b squared. Plus or minus just means I'm going to have two answers. And then b squared minus 4ac under a square root, and then all divided by 2a. So let's plug this in. So remember, the whole point of this is to solve for x. So x equals minus, what's b? Negative 6. Plus or minus, that's 2 different answers. So then we have b squared, so that's minus 6 squared. Please use the parentheses or you will make a mistake with your calculator. Minus 4 times 2 times 1. Here's b. Here's a and c. And so then we're going to put that all over 2 times 2. Now, there is no plus or minus key on your calculator. You just have to do the problem twice, once with an addition sign and once with a subtraction sign. So let's simplify everything else first. First of all, minus minus 6, that becomes plus 6. I'm just putting the plus there so that we can keep track of why the sign changed. You don't have to, although it's a good idea because it keeps track of why the sign changed. Then it's plus or minus. And then we have the square root of 36 minus 8. All over 4. So far, all I've done is simplify the pieces of the equation. So let's simplify a little bit more. 6 plus or minus the square root of 28 over 4. So now I have to have two answers. The way that I get that is I have 6 plus the square root of 28 over 4, and I have 6 minus the square root of 28 over 4. Those are my two answers. Now, if you need decimals, put it in the calculator. 6 plus the square root of 27 over 4 is 2.8. And 6 minus the square root of 24 divided by 4 is 0.2. That's it. Identify A, B, and C and plug it into the formula, which you always have access to. And there are all kinds of funny songs on YouTube to help you memorize it. But using the quadratic formula always works, and it's my go-to method because in most cases it's easier than factoring. But speaking of factoring, let's go look at what that looks like. Before we do, let's talk about extraneous answers. Extraneous answers mean answers that don't make sense. So you want to ignore answers that don't make sense. So if we were talking about distance, and we were using the quadratic formula for whatever reason, and one of the answers was -5, distance can't be negative. So obviously that answer doesn't apply in this case. That would be an extraneous answer, one that doesn't work for what we're doing. If we were doing area and we got a negative number, that's an extraneous answer because you can't have a negative area. But let's look at factoring. So again, last year you spent way more time than you wanted to doing this. So factoring is called the zero product factory, zero product property. So when we factor, what we're trying to do is figure out how to make one part of the equation 0 so that that forces our answer. So the first thing, again, has to be in standard form. So I'm going to minus 9x and minus 36 from both sides. Now the 14 and the 36 can combine, but the x and the 14 and the x squared cannot. So we get x squared minus 9x minus 22 equals 0. Okay, so now we're in standard form. So last year,
when you were talking about factoring, you made this little X. You said, okay, I need two numbers that multiply to give me negative 22, that add to give me negative 9. So the two numbers that give me 22, so I just start looking at factors of 22. That's 1 and 22, and 2 and 11. Those are the only factors of 22. Which one of those, when I combine them somehow, will give me 9? Well, since I have a negative product, one of them is going to be a negative number, so I should be able to subtract. So if I do negative 11 and 2, that's negative 11 times 2 and negative 11 plus 2. So that works. So that means that these are my factors that I can replace this with. So when I clean this up, this is x minus 11 and x plus 2 equals 0. If I were to FOIL this out, I would end up with my original quadratic. So now we just set each equation equal to 0. So either x minus 11 equals 0, because in order for the answer to be 0, either this is 0 or this is 0. One of the two of those has to be the case. So that means that x is 11 or x is negative 2. So then I would write my answer, x equals 11, comma, negative 2. Those are the two most common methods for solving quadratics. We will be doing that, or using quadratic equations for the rest of our secants and tangents and chords information. And so remembering how to either use the quadratic formula up here, my vote is for this one, or how to factor is your other option.